A millionaire sees a starving child looking at food in the supermarket and tries to help him. Brock Harrington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse suite, gazing out at the twinkling lights of Oakdale, Illinois. At 42, he had everything a man could want: a thriving tech company, more money than he could spend in a lifetime, and a stunning home in the heart of the city. Yet, as he sipped his scotch, the emptiness inside him threatened to swallow him whole. The amber liquid burned his throat, a welcome distraction from the memories that haunted him. It had been 15 years since Lydia walked out of his life, leaving him with a shattered heart and trust issues that ran deeper than the Grand Canyon. Since then, Brock had thrown himself into his work, building Harrington Technologies from the ground up. His success was undeniable, but the cost had been steep. No lasting relationships, no family, just an endless parade of business meetings and lonely nights. As he turned away from the window, his eyes fell on a framed photo on his desk. It was from happier times, Brock and his best friend, Jake, grinning at the camera, their arms around each other's shoulders. The photo had been taken just days before Brock's world came crashing down. He still remembered the moment he walked in on Jake and Lydia, tangled in each other's arms. The betrayal had been like a knife to his gut, twisting and turning until he could barely breathe. Brock tossed back the rest of his scotch and headed for bed. Tomorrow was another day of meetings and conference calls, another day of pretending that success was all he needed to be happy. Little did he know that fate had other plans in store for him. The next morning, Brock decided to do something he rarely did: go grocery shopping himself. His housekeeper usually took care of such mundane tasks, but today, he felt an inexplicable urge to get out of the office and do something normal. As he pushed his cart down the aisles of Oakdale's most upscale supermarket, he couldn't help but feel out of place. The other shoppers seemed to move with purpose, knowing exactly what they needed and where to find it. Brock, on the other hand, found himself overwhelmed by the sheer variety of options. Did he really need 5 different types of mustard? It was as he stood deliberating between 2 brands of organic free-range eggs that he first noticed the boy. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with a mop of unruly brown hair and clothes that had seen better days. But it wasn't the boy's appearance that caught Brock's attention. It was the look of naked hunger in his eyes as he stared at the prepared foods section. Brock watched as the boy inched closer to the rotisserie chickens, his small hand reaching out before quickly pulling back as if burned. The internal struggle was plain on his face, desperation warring with the knowledge that what he was contemplating was wrong. Before he could think better of it, Brock approached the boy. "Hey there," he said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Are you hungry?" The boy's eyes widened in fear and he took a step back. I wasn't going to take anything," he stammered. "I promise." Brock's heart clenched at the fear in the child's voice. "It's okay," he said, keeping his tone gentle. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I just noticed you looking at the food, and I thought maybe you could use a meal." The boy hesitated, eyeing Brock warily. "My mum says I'm not supposed to talk to strangers." "That's very smart of your mum." Brock nodded approvingly. "How about this? My name is Brock. Now we're not strangers anymore. What's your name?" After a moment's pause, the boy replied, "Ethan." "Nice to meet you, Ethan. Now how about we get you something to eat? You can pick out whatever you want." Ethan's eyes lit up, but then dimmed just as quickly. "I can't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom's sick and we don't have much money. I should be getting home to her." Brock felt a surge of compassion. "Tell you what," he said, making a split-second decision. "Why don't we get some food for both you and your mom? I'd be happy to help out." Ethan looked at him in disbelief. "Really? You'd do that for us?" "Absolutely," Brock smiled. "Consider it my good deed for the day." As they walked through the store, Brock encouraged Ethan to pick out things he and his mother liked. The boy was hesitant at first, but soon he was pointing out items with growing enthusiasm. Brock noticed that Ethan's choices were practical, simple, nutritious foods that would stretch their budget. It was clear that this child had been forced to grow up too fast. By the time they reached the checkout, the cart was full of groceries. Ethan's eyes were wide as he watched the total climb higher and higher, but Brock didn't bat an eye as he handed over his credit card. As they loaded the bags into Brock's car, Ethan turned to him with a serious expression. Thank you, Mr. Brock. You have no idea how much this means to us. Brock felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. You're very welcome, Ethan. Now let's get you and this food home to your mom. As they drove through the streets of Oakdale, Brock couldn't help but wonder what he was getting himself into. But looking at Ethan's hopeful face in the rearview mirror, he knew he couldn't turn back now. Little did he know. This chance encounter was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The car wound its way through increasingly run-down neighborhoods, the pristine lawns and manicured hedges giving way to cracked sidewalks and boarded-up windows. Brock felt a twinge of guilt as he realized how different Ethan's world was from his own. Finally, they pulled up in front of a small, dilapidated house. The paint was peeling, and the small patch of lawn was overgrown, but there were potted flowers on the porch, a small attempt at beauty in the midst of hardship. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice a mix of pride and embarrassment. "It's not much, but it's home." Brock smiled reassuringly. "It looks lovely, Ethan. Now let's get these groceries inside to your mom." As they approached the front door, it swung open, revealing a woman in her mid-30s. She was thin to the point of frailty, with dark circles under her eyes, but there was a fierce love in her gaze as it landed on Ethan. "Ethan, where have you been? I was worried sick." Her eyes widened as she took in Brock and the bags of groceries. "What's going on?" Ethan rushed to his mother, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Mom, this is Mr. Brock. He bought us food." The woman's face cycled through a range of emotions: confusion, suspicion, and finally a cautious gratitude. I don't know what to say, thank you, but why?" Brock set down the bags he was carrying and extended his hand. "Brock Harrington, ma'am. I met Ethan at the supermarket and, well, it seemed like you could use a hand. I hope you don't mind." She hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "Melanie Foster. No, I don't mind. It's just unexpected. Please come in." As they entered the small house, Brock was struck by how clean and orderly it was, despite the obvious signs of poverty. Melanie moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane, but she directed Ethan and Brock to put the groceries in the kitchen. "Mr. Brock, you really didn't have to do this," Melanie said as she sank into a worn armchair. "We get by." Brock took a seat on the threadbare couch. It was no trouble, really. "So Ethan's a great kid, and when he mentioned you were sick, I wanted to help." Melanie's eyes filled with tears. "He is a great kid. The best. I don't know what I'd do without him." She reached out and squeezed Ethan's hand as he perched on the arm of her chair. "Ever since I got sick, he's been my rock." "If you don't mind me asking," Brock said gently, "what happened?" Melanie sighed. "It started with back pain. I thought it was just from my job. I was a nurse, you see. But then it got worse. The doctors, they're not sure exactly what's wrong. Some days are better than others, but I haven't been able to work in months." Brock felt a surge of admiration for this woman, who, despite everything, was clearly doing her best to provide a loving home for Ethan. "That must be incredibly difficult," he said. "Is there any treatment that could help?" Melanie's laugh was bitter. "Oh, there are treatments. But without insurance, well, let's just say they're out of reach." An idea began to form in Brock's mind. He had the resources to help this family, really help them, not just with a few bags of groceries, but he hesitated. He'd been burned before by trusting too easily. Could he risk opening his heart again? As if sensing his internal struggle, Ethan spoke up. "Mr. Brock, would you like to stay for dinner? I can make spaghetti with the stuff you bought us." Melanie started to protest, but Brock found himself nodding. "I'd love to, Ethan, thank you." As Ethan bustled around the kitchen, chattering away about his school and his friends, Brock and Melanie fell into conversation. He learned that she had adopted Ethan when he was just a baby, after his birth mother, a patient of Melanie's, had passed away. "It wasn't the plan," Melanie admitted, her eyes soft as she watched Ethan. "But the moment I held him, I knew he was meant to be mine." Brock felt something shift inside him. Here was a woman who had opened her heart and her home to a child in need, who was fighting every day to give that child a good life. How could he do any less? As they sat down to a simple but delicious meal of spaghetti and garlic bread, Brock made a decision. "Melanie," he said, setting down his fork, "I'd like to help. Not just with groceries, but with your medical care. I have connections at Oakdale Memorial Hospital. I could make some calls, get you the treatment you need. Melanie's fork clattered to her plate. Mr. Harrington, that's too much. We can't accept that. Please, Brock said, surprising himself with the intensity of his plea. Let me do this. For both of you. Ethan looked between the adults, his eyes wide with hope. Mom, please. Maybe the doctors can make you better. Melanie's resolve visibly crumbled in the face of her son's pleading. Okay, if you're sure, Mr. Harrington. Brock, please, he insisted, and I've never been more sure of anything. As he left the foster home that evening, Brock felt lighter than he had in years. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but for the first time in a long time, he was excited about the future. Little did he know the past he thought he'd left behind was about to come crashing back into his life, threatening everything he was beginning to hold dear. Over the next few weeks, Brock found himself spending more and more time with the Fosters. He arranged for Melanie to see the best specialists at Oakdale Memorial, covering all the expenses without a second thought. On days when Melanie had appointments, Brock would pick up Ethan from school, marveling at how quickly the boy had wormed his way into his heart. One sunny Saturday, Brock decided to surprise them with a trip to the Oakdale Botanical Gardens. As he pulled up to their house, he couldn't help but smile at the sight of Ethan, bouncing excitedly on the porch, Melanie beside him, looking stronger and happier than she had when they first met. Mr. Brock, Ethan called out, running to the car. Are we really going to the gardens? I've always wanted to go. Brock chuckled as he helped Melanie into the passenger seat. We sure are, buddy. And I hear they have an amazing butterfly pavilion. As they strolled through the lush gardens, Brock found himself opening up to Melanie in a way he hadn't with anyone in years. He told her about his company, about the long hours and dedication it had taken to build it from nothing. It sounds lonely, Melanie observed softly as they watched Ethan chasing butterflies in the pavilion. All that success, but no one to share it with. Brock was quiet for a moment. It was for a long time. But lately things have been looking up. He smiled at her, and Melanie felt her cheeks warm. As they exited the pavilion, Brock froze. Standing just a few feet away, looking just as shocked, was a face he never thought he'd see again. Brock, the woman gasped. Is that really you? Melanie felt Brock stiffen beside her. Lydia, he said, his voice cold. What are you doing here? The woman, Lydia, took a step forward, her eyes darting between Brock, Melanie, and Ethan, who had come to stand protectively by his mother's side. I live here now, in Oakdale. I moved back a few years ago. Her gaze lingered on Ethan. Is this your family? Before Brock could respond, Ethan piped up, Mr. Brock's our friend. He's been helping my mom get better. Lydia's eyes widened. Oh, I see. That's wonderful, Brock. You always did have a big heart. Brock's laugh was harsh. That's rich coming from you. He turned to Melanie and Ethan. I'm sorry, but I think we need to cut our trip short. I'll explain in the car. The ride home was tense, with Ethan picking up on the adult's mood and remaining uncharacteristically quiet in the back seat. Once they arrived at the foster home, Brock helped Melanie inside and asked Ethan to give them a moment alone. I owe you an explanation, Brock said, running a hand through his hair. Lydia, she's my ex-girlfriend. From a long time ago. Melanie reached out and squeezed his hand. You don't owe me anything, Brock, but if you want to talk about it, I'm here to listen. And so, for the first time in 15 years, Brock told the story of his heartbreak. He told Melanie about falling in love with Lydia in college, about building dreams of a future together. And then, with pain evident in every word, he told her about coming home early one day to find Lydia in bed with his best friend, Jake. I trusted them both completely, Brock said, his voice rough with emotion. And they betrayed me in the worst way possible. After that, well, I threw myself into my work. It was easier than risking my heart again. Melanie's eyes shone with understanding and compassion. Oh, Brock, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. No wonder you've kept people at arm's length. Brock looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift inside him. Until now, he said softly. Melanie, you and Ethan, you've brought something into my life that I thought I'd lost forever. Hope, joy, The chance to be part of something bigger than myself. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. Brock, But before she could finish her thought, Ethan burst into the room, his face pale. Mom! Mr. Brock, come quick. There's a man at the door. He says he's my dad. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Brock and Melanie exchanged shocked glances. What? Melanie gasped, struggling to her feet. Ethan, honey, that's impossible. You know I adopted you. Brock felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. Let me handle this, he said, placing a steadying hand on Melanie's arm. Ethan, stay with your mum. As Brock approached the front door, he could make out a man's silhouette through the frosted glass. His heart was pounding in his ears as he opened the door, only to feel as if he'd been punched in the gut. Standing on the porch, looking older but unmistakable, was Jake, his former best friend and the man who had betrayed him all those years ago. Jake, Brock said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. What the hell are you doing here? Jake's eyes widened in recognition. Brock, what are you doing here? He shook his head as if to clear it. Never mind that. I'm looking for Melanie Foster. This is her address, right? Before Brock could respond, Melanie appeared behind him, leaning heavily on her cane. I'm Melanie Foster, she said, her voice wavering slightly. Who are you? And what do you mean claiming to be Ethan's father? Jake's gaze softened as it landed on Melanie. Miss Foster, my name is Jake Holloway. I think there's been a mistake, a wonderful, miraculous mistake. He took a deep breath. 15 years ago, my girlfriend gave birth to a baby boy at Oakdale Memorial Hospital. She told me the baby died, but I recently found out that wasn't true. She had given him up for adoption. Melanie's face drained of color. 15 years ago, at Oakdale Memorial. She turned to look at Ethan, who was peeking out from behind the living room doorway, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Brock felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The timing, the location, it all fit. But that would mean, Jake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This girlfriend of yours, it was Lydia, wasn't it? Jake nodded, his expression a mix of shame and old pain. Yes, Lydia Pearson. After what happened between us, Brock, she found out she was pregnant. She told me it was mine, but, well, I guess she wasn't sure. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that Brock could scarcely believe. He turned to Melanie, who was swaying slightly on her feet. Melanie, maybe we should all sit down. This is a lot to take in. As they moved to the living room, Ethan rushed to his mother's side. Mom, what's going on? Who is this man? Melanie pulled Ethan close, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to figure it out together, okay? Once they were all seated, an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. It was Brock who finally broke it. Jake, start from the beginning. Tell us everything. And so Jake began to unravel a tale that seemed almost too incredible to be true. He spoke of his relationship with Lydia after the affair, of her pregnancy, and the supposed loss of their child. He explained how he had recently run into an old nurse from Oakdale Memorial who had let slip that Lydia's baby hadn't died, but had been given up for adoption. I've been searching for months, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. And all signs pointed here. To Ethan, Melanie, who had been listening with growing distress, finally spoke up. But I don't understand. Ethan's birth mother, she was a patient of mine, a young woman named Sarah, Ethan supplied quietly. You told me her name was Sarah. Melanie nodded, looking bewildered. Yes, Sarah, she died shortly after giving birth. That's why I adopted Ethan. There was no father in the picture. Brock, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly stood up. I think I know what happened, he said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. Lydia, she must have used a false name when she gave birth. She lied to everyone. To you, Jake, to the hospital, to Melanie. The room fell silent as the implications of this sank in. Ethan, who had been listening with growing confusion and distress, finally burst out, So who am I? Who are my real parents? Melanie pulled him close, tears streaming down her face. Oh, sweetheart, I'm your real mother. I've loved you and raised you since the day you were born. Nothing will ever change that. Jake leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Ethan. And I believe I'm your biological father. I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you all these years. I thought you were gone. Ethan's eyes darted between Jake, Melanie, and Brock, clearly overwhelmed. "And you?" he asked, looking at Brock. "Where do you fit in all this?" Brock felt as if his heart was being torn in two. He had come to care deeply for Ethan and Melanie, had started to imagine a future with them. But now... "I'm an old friend of your biological parents," he said softly. "And I care about you and your mom very much." The tension in the room was palpable. Years of secrets and lies were unraveling, leaving everyone reeling in their wake. Melanie was clinging to Ethan as if afraid he might disappear, while Jake couldn't take his eyes off the son he never knew he had. And Brock. Brock felt as if he was losing everything all over again. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the room, Brock knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The past had come crashing into the present, and the future he had begun to hope for seemed to be slipping away like sand through his fingers. But as he looked at Ethan's confused face, at Melanie's tear-stained cheeks, and even at Jake's hopeful eyes, Brock made a decision. He had run from pain and commitment for 15 years. He had let one betrayal define his life, but not anymore. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they faced, Brock knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to run away this time. These people, as complicated and messy as their situation was, had become his family. And family, he was learning, was worth fighting for. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. Brock, despite his initial shock and anger, found himself acting as a mediator between Jake and the Fosters. It wasn't easy, especially given his history with Jake, but he knew it was necessary for Ethan's sake. Melanie, for her part, was struggling to come to terms with the fact that the story she had believed for so long, the story of Ethan's origins, was a fabrication. She alternated between fierce protectiveness of her son and moments of doubt, wondering if she had the right to keep Ethan from his biological father. Jake, overwhelmed by the discovery of his son, was doing his best to respect Melanie's position while also trying to forge a connection with Ethan. It was a delicate balance, made all the more complicated by the history between Jake and Brock, and at the center of it all was Ethan, a young boy suddenly faced with a tidal wave of adult complications. He clung to Melanie, the only mother he had ever known, while cautiously getting to know Jake. His curious nature led him to ask questions that often left the adults fumbling for answers. One evening, about a week after Jake's appearance, Brock found himself sitting on the Fosters' porch swing with Melanie. Ethan was inside, showing Jake his science project, and the sound of their laughter drifted through the open windows. "How are you holding up?" Brock asked softly, noting the dark circles under Melanie's eyes. Melanie sighed, leaning her head against Brock's shoulder. "Honestly? I'm terrified. Ethan is my whole world, Brock. The thought of losing him." "Hey," Brock said, wrapping an arm around her. "You're not going to lose him. You're his mother, Melanie. Nothing can change that." "But Jake is his biological father," Melanie whispered. "He has rights. What if he decides to fight for custody?" Brock was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I've known Jake for a long time," he finally said. "Despite everything that happened between us, I know he's a good man at heart. I don't think he'd do anything to hurt Ethan, and that includes tearing him away from you." Melanie nodded, but Brock could feel the tension in her body. "There's something else," she said hesitantly. "Something I haven't told anyone." Brock pulled back slightly so he could look at her face. "What is it?" Melanie took a deep breath. "The treatments, they're working, Brock. Better than anyone expected. The doctors think I might make a full recovery." "Melanie, that's wonderful news," Brock exclaimed, but then he saw the conflict in her eyes. "Isn't it?" "Of course it is," she said quickly. "It's just, Brock, you've done so much for us. The medical bills, the outings, everything. I'm worried that once I'm better, once I can work again, will you still want to be part of our lives?" Brock felt his heart constrict at the vulnerability in her voice. "Melanie," he said, taking her hands in his, "I'm not here because you need help. I'm here because I care about you and Ethan. Because somehow, without me even realizing it, you've become the most important people in my life." Melanie's eyes filled with tears. "Really? Really?" Brock affirmed. "In fact, I've been thinking, once things settle down a bit, maybe we could—" But before he could finish his thought, they were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up to the curb. Brock felt Melanie stiffen beside him. as they both recognized the driver. Lydia. She stepped out of the car, looking nervous but determined. As she approached the porch, Brock stood, unconsciously placing himself between Lydia and Melanie. "What are you doing here, Lydia?" he asked, his voice cold. Lydia flinched at his tone but held her ground. I heard that Jake found Ethan. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came out. I came to explain." "Explain?" Melanie's voice was sharp as she stood up, gripping her cane tightly. "Explain how you lied to everyone? How you gave up your child and let everyone believe he was dead?" Lydia's composure cracked and tears began to fall. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I was young and scared and I made so many mistakes, but please, I need to talk to Ethan. He deserves to know the truth from me." Before either Brock or Melanie could respond, the front door opened. Jake stood there, his face a mask of shock as he saw Lydia, and behind him, peering around with wide, curious eyes, was Ethan. "Mom?" Ethan said, looking at Melanie. "Who's that lady?" The adults exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Melanie sighed and held out her hand to Ethan. "Come here, sweetheart. There's someone you need to meet." As Ethan stepped onto the porch, Lydia gasped softly. "He looks just like you, Jake," she whispered. Ethan looked between the adults, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What's going on?" Brock knelt down so he was at eye level with Ethan. "Remember how we talked about how families can be complicated sometimes? Well, this is Lydia. She's your birth mother." Ethan's eyes widened as he looked at Lydia. "But I thought my birth mom died." "That was a lie, sweetheart," Melanie said gently, her voice breaking. "We just found out the truth ourselves." Lydia took a tentative step forward. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I know this must be very confusing for you." Ethan looked up at Melanie, then at Jake, and finally back at Lydia. His young face was a picture of conflicting emotions: curiosity, confusion, and a hint of anger. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why did you give me away?" The adults all held their breath, waiting for Lydia's response. This was the moment of truth, the explanation they had all been waiting for. As Lydia opened her mouth to speak, the tension on the porch was palpable. But before she could utter a word, a sudden gust of wind swept through, scattering leaves across the yard and causing the porch swing to creak ominously. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how this tangled web of lies and love would finally unravel. In that suspended moment, Brock looked at the faces around him: Melanie's fierce protectiveness, Jake's hopeful uncertainty, Lydia's tearful remorse, and Ethan's innocent confusion. He realized that whatever came next would change all of their lives forever. And as Lydia began to speak, her voice trembling with the weight of 15 years of secrets, Brock knew that the true test of their newfound family was only just beginning. Lydia's explanation, when it finally came, was a tangled web of fear, guilt, and misguided attempts at protection. She spoke of her affair with Jake, of the crushing guilt she felt towards Brock, and of the overwhelming fear of becoming a mother when she felt so lost herself. "I convinced myself that you'd be better off without me," Lydia said, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "I thought Jake would be better off thinking you were gone, rather than tied to me and the mistakes I'd made. And Brock, I couldn't bear the thought of him knowing I was pregnant, not knowing if the baby was his or Jake's." The adults listened in stunned silence, but it was Ethan who spoke up, his young voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "But what about me? Didn't you think I might want to know my real parents?" Lydia flinched as if she'd been struck. "Oh, Ethan, I'm so sorry. I was wrong, so terribly wrong. If I could go back and change things, I would in a heartbeat." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the porch, the group moved inside. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken emotions and lingering questions. Melanie made coffee for the adults and hot chocolate for Ethan, her hands shaking slightly as she moved around the kitchen. Brock found himself watching her, marveling at her strength in the face of such upheaval. Here was a woman who had taken in a child not her own, who had loved him unconditionally for 15 years, and who was now facing the possibility of losing him. Yet she moved with grace, offering comfort to Ethan with a gentle touch or a soft word. As they all settled in the living room, an uncomfortable silence fell. It was Jake who finally broke it. "So, where do we go from here?" he asked, looking around at the unlikely group they formed. Brock leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I think the most important thing is to remember that Ethan's well-being comes first. Whatever issues we adults have with each other, we need to put them aside for his sake." Melanie nodded, pulling Ethan close to her side. "Agreed. Ethan, honey, how are you feeling about all this?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, his young face scrunched in thought. "I'm confused," he finally said, "and a little angry, but also, I don't know. Curious, I guess. I mean, I always wondered about my birth parents, but I never thought I'd actually meet them." Jake leaned forward, his eyes soft as he looked at his son. "Ethan, I want you to know that I would have been there for you if I had known. I've missed out on so much of your life, and I'd like the chance to get to know you, if you're okay with that." Ethan nodded slowly. I think I'd like that too, but," he added quickly, looking up at Melanie, "you're still my mom. That's not going to change." Melanie's eyes filled with tears as she hugged Ethan tightly. "Oh, sweetheart, I'll always be your mom, no matter what." Lydia, who had been quietly watching this exchange, spoke up hesitantly. "Ethan, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to give me a chance too? To get to know you?" All eyes turned to Ethan, who looked overwhelmed by the weight of the decision. Brock, sensing the boy's distress, intervened. "How about we take things one step at a time?" he suggested gently. "There's no need to make any big decisions right now. We can all agree to spend some time together, get to know each other better and see how things go. Does that sound okay, Ethan?" Ethan nodded, visibly relieved. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." As the night wore on, tentative plans were made. Jake and Lydia would start with short visits, always supervised by Melanie or Brock. They would take things slowly, allowing Ethan time to process and adjust to the changes in his life. It was well past midnight when Jake and Lydia finally left, leaving Brock alone with Melanie and a sleeping Ethan, who had dozed off on the couch. "You were amazing tonight," Brock said softly to Melanie as they stood in the kitchen, cleaning up the last of the coffee cups. "I don't know how you managed to stay so calm and composed through all of that." Melanie sighed, leaning against the counter. "Honestly? I'm terrified, Brock. What if Ethan decides he wants to live with his biological parents? What if Jake and Lydia try to take him away from me?" Brock set down the dish towel and took Melanie's hands in his. "Hey, look at me," he said gently. "That's not going to happen. Ethan loves you. You're the only mother he's ever known. And Jake and Lydia, they made mistakes, but they're not bad people. I truly believe they want what's best for Ethan." Melanie nodded, but Brock could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. "And what about us?" she asked softly. "Where do we fit into all of this?" Brock felt his heart race at the question. It was something he'd been thinking about a lot lately, especially in the wake of all these revelations. "Melanie," he began, his voice low and serious, "I know this isn't the best timing, but I need you to know something. These past few months, getting to know you and Ethan, it's changed my life. You've shown me what it means to have a family, to love unconditionally." Melanie's breath caught in her throat. "Brock, let me finish," he said, squeezing her hands gently. "I know things are complicated right now with Jake and Lydia back in the picture, but I want you to know that I'm here for both you and Ethan. Whatever happens, whatever you need, I'm not going anywhere." Tears spilled down Melanie's cheeks as she looked up at Brock. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she whispered. "You've been our rock through all of this." Brock pulled her close, wrapping her in a tight embrace. As they stood there in the quiet kitchen, holding each other, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. True to their word, Jake and Lydia started with short, supervised visits. At first, these encounters were awkward and tense, with Ethan often clinging to Melanie for reassurance. But as time went on, a tentative rapport began to develop. Jake, it turned out, shared Ethan's love of science and astronomy. Their visits often involved impromptu lessons about the solar system or discussions about the latest NASA missions. Lydia, for her part, discovered that she and Ethan shared a talent for art. She began bringing sketching supplies to their visits, and soon the foster home was filled with Ethan's colorful drawings. Brock watched all of this with a mixture of emotions. On one hand, he was happy to see Ethan forming connections with his biological parents. On the other, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy. Over the past few months, he had come to think of Ethan as his own in a way, and seeing Jake step into a fatherly role was more difficult than he had anticipated. One evening, after Jake and Lydia had left following a particularly successful visit, Brock found Melanie sitting on the porch swing, a pensive look on her face. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked, settling beside her. Melanie smiled wryly. "I was just thinking about how much has changed in such a short time. A few months ago it was just Ethan and me against the world, and now you have a whole team of people who care about Ethan." Brock finished for her. "Is that such a bad thing?" Melanie shook her head. "No, it's not. It's just, I guess I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. For Jake or Lydia to decide they want more than just visits." Brock wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Have they given you any reason to think that might happen?" "No," Melanie admitted. "They've been respectful of my role in Ethan's life. It's just hard not to worry." "I understand," Brock said softly. "But Melanie, I've been thinking, maybe it's time we formalize things a bit. To give you some peace of mind." Melanie turned to look at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Brock took a deep breath. This wasn't how he had planned to do this, but somehow it felt right. "I mean," he said, his heart pounding, "maybe it's time we think about making our little family official. Melanie Foster, will you marry me?" Melanie's eyes widened in shock. "Brock, are you sure? With everything that's going on, I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Brock said firmly. "I love you, Melanie, I love Ethan, and I want to spend the rest of my life with both of you. What do you say?" Tears spilled down Melanie's cheeks as a smile broke across her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Brock Harrington." As they sealed their engagement with a kiss, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street. Lydia stood there, a conflicted expression on her face, before turning and walking away into the night. Little did they know their happiness was about to be tested in ways they could never have imagined. For Lydia, torn between her growing love for the son she had given up and her lingering feelings for Brock, was about to make a decision that would shake their newfound family to its very core. The news of Brock and Melanie's engagement spread quickly. Ethan was overjoyed, throwing his arms around Brock and declaring, "Now you'll really be my dad." Jake and Lydia offered their congratulations, though Brock couldn't help but notice a flicker of something: regret, jealousy, in Lydia's eyes. As summer turned to fall, wedding plans began in earnest. Melanie, her health continuing to improve, threw herself into the preparations with enthusiasm. Brock, for his part, found himself happier than he had ever been. The wounds of his past betrayal were finally healing, replaced by the joy of the family he was building with Melanie and Ethan. But as the wedding day approached, a shadow began to loom over their happiness. It started with small things: Lydia showing up unannounced for visits, lingering longer than agreed upon. She began to ask Ethan more pointed questions about his life with Melanie, about how he would feel living in a bigger house, going to a better school. Melanie, already stressed from the wedding preparations and her ongoing medical treatments, began to withdraw. She spent more time alone, her old fears resurfacing. Brock tried to reassure her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. His suspicions were confirmed one crisp October morning, just 2 weeks before the wedding. Brock arrived at the Foster home to find Melanie in tears, a crumpled letter in her hand. "What's wrong?" he asked, rushing to her side. "Melanie, talk to me." Through her sobs, Melanie managed to explain. "It's Lydia," she choked out. She's suing for custody of Ethan." Brock felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. "What? But she can't. She gave up her rights years ago." Melanie shook her head. "The letter, it says she's claiming the adoption wasn't valid, that she was coerced into giving Ethan up." "Brock, what if they take him away from me?" Brock pulled her close, his mind racing. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. "We'll fight this, Melanie, together." The next few days were a blur of legal consultations and frantic phone calls. Jake, when confronted, swore he knew nothing about Lydia's plans. He seemed genuinely shocked and upset, promising to talk to Lydia and try to change her mind. Ethan, picking up on the tension in the house, became withdrawn and irritable. He spent more time in his room, emerging only for meals and school. Brock's heart broke every time he saw the confusion and fear in the boy's eyes. It all came to a head the night before the first court hearing. Brock and Melanie were sitting at the kitchen table going over their strategy with their lawyer when there was a frantic knocking at the door. When Brock opened it, he found Lydia standing there, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm so sorry, I've made a terrible mistake." Melanie appeared behind Brock, her face hard. "Haven't you done enough?" she snapped. "What more do you want from us?" Lydia held up her hands pleadingly. "Please just hear me out. I've dropped the custody suit. I realize now how selfish and wrong I was." Brock and Melanie exchanged skeptical glances. "Why the sudden change of heart?" Brock asked warily. Lydia took a deep breath. "I overheard Ethan talking to Jake yesterday. He was so upset. He said he hated me for trying to take him away from his real mom. And he's right. Melanie, you're his mother in every way that matters. I was fooling myself thinking I could just step in and take your place." Melanie's expression softened slightly. "Lydia, But before she could finish, they were interrupted by a small voice from the top of the stairs. "Mom, Dad, what's going on?" They all turned to see Ethan standing there, looking small and vulnerable in his pajamas. Brock's heart swelled at hearing Ethan call him Dad, even as he worried about how much the boy had overheard. Melanie held out her arms. "Come here, sweetheart, there's nothing to worry about. Everything's going to be okay." As Ethan came down the stairs and into Melanie's embrace, Lydia stepped back. "I should go," she said softly. I wanted you to know that I'm withdrawing the suit. And if you'll let me, I'd like to continue being a part of Ethan's life. On your terms, of course." Brock and Melanie looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Brock nodded. "We'll talk about it," he said. "But Lydia, you have to understand, Melanie and I are getting married. We're going to be Ethan's parents. If you want to be in his life, it has to be as an extended family member. Can you accept that?" Lydia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I can, thank you." As Lydia turned to leave, Ethan suddenly spoke up. "Wait," he said, his voice small but determined. He looked up at Melanie, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, Ethan approached Lydia. "I'm glad you're not trying to take me away anymore," he said. And maybe we can still do art together sometimes." Lydia knelt down, meeting Ethan's eyes. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. "If it's okay with your mum and dad." Ethan turned to look at Brock and Melanie, his expression hopeful. Brock felt the last of his reservations melt away. This boy, with his big heart and capacity for forgiveness, was truly remarkable. "We'll work something out," Brock said, smiling at Ethan. "As a family." As Lydia left, closing the door softly behind her, Brock looked at Melanie and Ethan, his fiancé and soon-to-be son, his family. They had weathered the storm together and come out stronger on the other side. 2 weeks later, on a beautiful autumn day, Brock and Melanie exchanged vows in a small ceremony in their backyard. Ethan stood proudly beside them, beaming as he handed over the rings. Jake and Lydia were there too, sitting quietly in the back, a testament to how far they had all come. As Brock kissed his bride, he felt a sense of completion wash over him. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but standing here, surrounded by love, he knew it had all been worth it. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Brock found himself alone on the porch swing. He looked out at the yard where Ethan was playing with some of the other children, his laughter carrying on the breeze. Melanie joined him, settling into his side with a contented sigh. "Happy?" she asked, looking up at him with shining eyes. Brock pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "More than I ever thought possible," he replied. As they sat there, watching the sun set on their wedding day, Brock marveled at the twists and turns that had led him to this moment. From heartbreak to healing, from loneliness to love, he had found his way back to happiness. And as Ethan ran up to them, throwing himself into their arms with a joyful laugh, Brock knew that this was just the beginning of their story. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family.